In the silent halls of memory, where dust settles upon the bones of empires and time moves like water through forgotten cities, there exists a name carved not in stone, but in bronze and jade, in oracle shells and ancient earth. A name whispered by the wind across 3,000 years. A name that defied the gravity of history itself. Fu Hao, Lady Hao, General Hao, High Priestess of the Spirits, Queen of a dynasty forged in bronze and blood. This is not a story of legends embellished by centuries of retelling. This is not mythology dressed as history. This is the account of a woman whose existence was written in the earliest Chinese script, whose deeds were recorded on tortoise shells and ox bones by scribes who watched her march to war, whose tomb lay undisturbed for 32 centuries, until archaeologists opened a door to a world we had almost forgotten. Let us walk backward through the corridors of time, past dynasties that rose and fell like the breathing of some great sleeping dragon, past the birth of philosophy and the death of innocence, past the Zhou who would conquer the Shang, past the whispers of Confucius who had not yet been born, back to an age when the Yellow River Valley trembled beneath the wheels of war chariots and the air shimmered with the heat of bronze forges. The year, as best as we can reckon across the gulf of millennia, was somewhere near 1200 years before the Common Era. The place, the heartland of what would one day be called China, though that name meant nothing to the people who lived and died beneath those ancient skies. They knew only Shang, the great settlement of Shang, an empire built on divination and warfare, on ancestor worship and bronze metallurgy, on oracle bones that cracked in fire to reveal the will of heaven. Imagine, if you will, a world where writing is still young, where each character carved into bone or cast into bronze is a small miracle of human thought made permanent, where the boundary between the living and the dead is thin as morning mist, and the ancestors walk among their descendants in dreams and visions, demanding sacrifice, offering guidance, shaping the course of battles yet to come. This was the Shang Dynasty during the reign of King Wu Ding, the 21st king of a lineage stretching back through legend to the mythical founder Tang, who overthrew the corrupt Xia dynasty and established a new order. Wu Ding ruled from the capital city of Yin, near modern Anyang in Henan province, a sprawling complex of palaces and workshops, foundries and temples, surrounded by settlements where artisans labored over bronze and jade, where farmers tended crops of millet and rice, where nobles consulted diviners about the proper days for planting, for marrying, for making war. The Shang world was smaller than ours, but no less complex. To the north and west lived nomadic peoples, the Shang called Fang, chiefdoms and tribes with names like Tufang and Guifang and Qiang. Sometimes these were allies, bound by marriage and tribute. Sometimes they were enemies, raiders who struck at Shang borders and melted back into the grasslands. The relationship shifted like sand, and the king's diviners consulted the oracle bones constantly, asking the ancestors, "Will the harvest be good? Will the queen bear a son? Will we prevail in battle?" The Shang maintained their power through two great pillars, ritual and warfare. The king was the bridge between heaven and earth, the intermediary who performed the sacred rites and offered sacrifices to the ancestors and to Shangdi, the Lord on high. But rituals alone could not hold an empire together. The Shang forged their domain in the furnace of constant warfare, expanding through conquest, defending against raids, exacting tribute from subjugated peoples. Bronze was the metal of power, bronze vessels for ritual wine offerings, bronze bells that rang in temple ceremonies, bronze weapons that gave Shang warriors a decisive edge over enemies still using stone and bone. The technology required to cast these objects was sophisticated beyond measure. Piece mold casting techniques that allowed artisans to create vessels of intricate beauty, adorned with coyote monster masks and stylized dragons, phoenixes and tigers, geometric patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in firelight. To make bronze, you needed copper and tin. To get copper and tin, you needed trade networks spanning hundreds of miles. To protect those networks, you needed armies. And so the wheel turned, season after season, year after year, the Shang expanding, consolidating, defending, always moving, always ready for war. Into this world of bronze and oracle bones, of ancestor worship and constant warfare, came Fu Hao. We do not know the exact year of her birth. The oracle bones, for all their detail, do not record such things. But we know she was born to privilege, likely the daughter of a chieftain or tribal leader from one of the allied Fang peoples. This could suggest she came from a border region, given the prominence of weapons in her tomb and her later military expertise. She was educated, literate in the oracle bone script, trained in the arts that befitted a woman of high station. But unlike most women of her time, Fu Hao also received military training. She learned the arts of war, strategy and tactics, the handling of weapons, the movement of troops across terrain. Why? We can only speculate. Perhaps her father recognized an unusual talent. Perhaps her people had a tradition of women warriors that has been lost to time. Perhaps it was simply the necessity of a border region where everyone, regardless of gender, needed to know how to fight. The oracle bones offer tantalizing hints, but no definitive answers. What we know with certainty is that Fu Hao came to the attention of King Wu Ding, and he chose her as one of his wives. Wu Ding was a king who understood power. To consolidate his rule, he married women from allied tribes and chiefdoms, creating a network of kinship ties that bound the Shang realm together. Historical records suggest he had 60 wives, perhaps more. In this constellation of royal consorts, most remained shadows, their names preserved only in ritual contexts, if at all. But Fu Hao was different. The name itself tells us something. Fu was not a family name, but a title, a designation for a woman of high rank. When she married Wu Ding and was granted her own fief, her own land and people to govern, she received the name Hao and became known as Fu Hao, Lady Hao. Later, after her death, she would be given the temple name Mu Xin, Mother Xin, and honored as an ancestral spirit in her own right. Out of all his wives, Wu Ding elevated 3 to the status of primary queens, women who participated in state rituals and were accorded special honor. Fu Hao was first among these 3. She was, the oracle bones make clear, the king's favorite, the one he trusted above all others. But their relationship was not simply one of affection. It was a partnership of equals, or as equal as any relationship could be in that hierarchical world. The oracle bones record Wu Ding consulting the spirits about Fu Hao's health when she was pregnant, expressing concern for her well-being, seeking divine protection for her and their unborn child. They had at least one son together, a prince named Xiao Yi, though he would die before his mother, a tragedy recorded in the oracle inscriptions. After the period of mourning following Wu Ding's father's death, the young king and his new queen traveled together through the countryside, inspecting farms and irrigation systems, meeting with local officials and commoners, listening to grievances and recommendations. It was during one of these tours that they discovered Fu Yue, a brilliant slave whose insights into defensive fortifications would earn him a place in Wu Ding's inner council. The king, it seemed, valued talent wherever he found it, and his queen shared that vision. But the countryside tours were brief respites. The Shang Dynasty faced threats on all sides, and Wu Ding's reign would be defined by warfare. The king organized his military into a force called the Three Armies, leading campaigns to reclaim rebellious vassals and expand Shang territory. And it was in this context, amid the drumbeat of constant warfare, that Fu Hao would step onto the stage of history in a role that would have been unthinkable in later Chinese dynasties, impossible in the Confucian world that would emerge 7 centuries later. She would become a general. The Tufang had been enemies of the Shang for generations, a powerful tribe to the northwest that raided Shang territory, attacking settlements, stealing livestock and crops, killing and capturing Shang people. For years, they had fought the Shang to a standstill, neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. Then came a moment of crisis. 2 Shang armies were on campaign, one to the southeast, one to the southwest, dealing with other threats to the realm. The Tufang chose that moment to strike from the north, a surprise attack that threatened the capital itself. Wu Ding needed to respond, and respond quickly. But his most experienced generals were far away with their armies. He needed someone he could trust, someone capable of independent command, someone who could move fast and strike hard. The oracle bones record what happened next in the spare, factual language of divination records. The king consulted the ancestors. He asked if he should send Fu Hao to lead an army against the Tufang. The answer, as interpreted through the cracks in heated bone, was auspicious. The spirits approved. Fu Hao was young, perhaps still in her teens or early 20s, though the sources don't specify her age. She had never led an army in battle. One might infer that the generals and nobles of the court were skeptical. A woman, leading troops into combat, against the formidable Tufang? This moment hints at a deeper tension, the unprecedented nature of Wu Ding's decision, the risk he was taking not just militarily, but politically, entrusting such responsibility to someone so unconventional. But Wu Ding trusted his wife. More than that, he trusted her abilities. He gave her a bronze battle axe, a yue, massive and deadly, weighing 9 kilograms, nearly 20 pounds. This was not a weapon for actual combat, but a symbol of command, proof of her authority as a military commander. On that axe, cast into the bronze itself, were 2 characters: Fu Hao, her name, her seal, her proof of power. We do not know the details of that first campaign. The oracle bones give us only fragments, the divine sanction, the outcome. But we know that Fu Hao led her troops north to meet the Tufang. We know that she fought them, and we know that she won. Not just won, she crushed them. The Tufang, who had resisted the Shang for generations, were decisively defeated. Those who survived fled back to their homelands, and when Fu Hao pursued them, pressing her advantage, she defeated them again, so thoroughly that the Tufang never again dared to raid Shang territory. Eventually, they would be absorbed into the Shang realm entirely, their people becoming subjects of the dynasty they had fought for so long. One can imagine the young general returning to Yin in triumph, her troops singing victory songs, the bronze axe carried before her like a banner. The oracle bones record that Wu Ding himself went out beyond the city gates to meet her, and they spent time together away from the eyes of the court, celebrating her victory. But this was just the beginning. After the defeat of the Tufang, Fu Hao's reputation was established. No longer was she simply one of the king's wives, no matter how favored. She was Fu Hao, the general, Fu Hao, the warrior, Fu Hao, who had done what generations of Shang commanders had failed to do. The oracle bone inscriptions from Wu Ding's reign mention Fu Hao in military contexts again and again, more than 170 to 180 times. These brief records, carved into tortoise plastrons and ox scapulae by court diviners, give us glimpses of a military career that spanned years, perhaps decades. She led campaigns against the Yi peoples to the east. She fought the Qiang to the west. She marched south against the Ba tribes. Each campaign is recorded in the oracle bones, the consultation with the ancestors, the king asking if Fu Hao should be sent, if the campaign would succeed, if she would return safely. Each time, she did return, each time victorious. The scale of her commands grew. In one campaign against the Qiang, Wu Ding entrusted her with more than 13,000 soldiers, the largest single military force recorded in all of Shang history. 13,000 warriors under the command of one woman. Serving under her were experienced generals like Zi and Hou Gao, men who had won their own victories, now taking orders from Fu Hao. Think about what this means. In an age when women in most societies were confined to domestic roles, when military command was the exclusive province of men, Fu Hao commanded armies larger than anything fielded by the contemporary kingdoms of Mesopotamia or Egypt. She led troops into battle not as a mascot or a figurehead, but as the supreme commander, making tactical decisions, planning strategy, determining the course of campaigns. The oracle bones record the mechanics of her campaigns, divinations about the best days to march, consultations about which route to take, questions about whether sacrifices should be made to ensure victory. One inscription records a question about whether Fu Hao should lead a two-pronged attack, coordinating her forces with those of another general to execute the earliest recorded large-scale ambush in Chinese history. The answer was yes. The ambush succeeded. She fought more than 20 separate military campaigns, defeating state after state, tribe after tribe. The Beitu, the Nanyi, the Nanbafeng, the Guifeng, names that once struck fear into Shang hearts, enemies that had threatened the dynasty's borders for years. One by one, Fu Hao defeated them, but she was more than a warrior. The oracle bones make it clear that Fu Hao also served as a high priestess, conducting sacred rituals that normally only the king himself could perform. This was extraordinary. Ritual matters were the most important political activity in Shang society, more important even than warfare. The king was the intermediary between heaven and earth, the one who communicated with the ancestors and made offerings to Shangdi. For Wu Ding to entrust these duties to Fu Hao shows the depth of his confidence in her and the unique position she held in the Shang hierarchy. She conducted sacrifices to the ancestors. She performed divinations. She prepared ritual bronze vessels and inscribed tortoise shells. She served as oracle caster, interpreting the cracks in heated bone to determine the will of the spirits. In the Shang worldview, where the boundary between the sacred and the secular was thin to non-existence, Fu Hao operated in both realms with equal authority, and she governed her own land. As a vassal lord, Fu Hao controlled a fief on the borders of the empire, with her own people, her own agricultural production, her own military force of approximately 3,000 soldiers. The oracle bones record her sending tribute to Wu Ding, the traditional obligation of a vassal to their overlord. But this also meant she had an independent power base, resources that were hers to command. She was queen, general, priestess, and lord. She embodied every form of power available in Shang society except the throne itself. And if the oracle bones are any indication, she wielded that power as effectively as any man in the realm, perhaps more so. To understand Fu Hao's military genius, we must understand the nature of warfare in the late Shang period. This was Bronze Age combat, very different from both the ancient warfare that preceded it and the Iron Age warfare that would follow. Shang armies were relatively small by later standards. A force of 10,000 was enormous. Most campaigns involved hundreds or a few thousand warriors. These armies were composed of different types of troops, nobles and their retainers, equipped with the finest bronze weapons and armor. Commoners conscripted for specific campaigns, specialists like archers and chariot crews. The chariot was the prestige weapon of the age. Each chariot was drawn by 2 or more horses and carried a crew of 3, a driver, an archer, and a warrior armed with a dagger axe or spear. These chariots were not the heavy shock weapons they would become in later centuries, but mobile platforms for archery and quick strikes. They could break up enemy formations, pursue fleeing troops, and provide a commanding view of the battlefield for officers. The possession of chariots gave the Shang a significant advantage over their enemies, many of whom fought on foot. Weapons were a mix of bronze and bone, stone and wood. The bow was king of the battlefield, composite bows made of wood, horn, and sinew, capable of launching arrows with deadly accuracy at significant range. Close combat weapons included the Mao, a spear, the Ge, a dagger axe mounted on a long pole, designed to hook and pull enemies from chariots or off their feet, and the Yue, the great battle axe, symbol of command and instrument of execution. Bronze helmets and leather armor provided some protection, though nothing like the full plate armor of later ages. Battles were fast and brutal. Armies maneuvered for position. Archers exchanged volleys. Chariots charged and wheeled and charged again. When lines clashed, it was hand-to-hand, close-quarters slaughter until one side broke and ran. Fu Hao understood all of this. The oracle bones record her attention to detail, asking the spirits about the best days to march, the proper routes to take, whether to press an attack or wait for reinforcements. She planned ambushes, coordinating multiple forces to trap enemies between converging armies. She understood logistics, the unglamorous art of keeping an army fed and supplied on campaign. She understood morale, knowing when to push her troops and when to let them rest. And she understood psychology. The very fact of her gender was a weapon. Enemies who underestimated her because she was a woman learned their mistake too late. Allies who fought beside her gained confidence from her presence. The oracle bones record Wu Ding repeatedly asking the ancestors if Fu Hao should be sent to deal with this threat or that crisis. The implication is clear. She was the king's go-to commander, the one he trusted most. In the campaign against the Ba, Fu Hao executed what historians consider the earliest recorded large-scale ambush in Chinese military history. The details are lost to time, but the outline is clear. She divided her forces, used terrain to her advantage, caught the enemy by surprise, and won a complete victory. This was not the triumph of superior numbers or better equipment, but of superior generalship. Fu Hao outthought her opponents and outfought them. She led from the front. The massive bronze Yue with her name inscribed on it was not just for show. It was a statement. Fu Hao is here. Fu Hao is in command. Fu Hao will lead you to victory or die trying. In an age when generals fought alongside their troops, when leadership meant personal courage and the willingness to risk death, Fu Hao embodied those virtues completely. One can imagine her on the battlefield, mounted on a chariot perhaps, or on horseback, visible to her troops in ceremonial armor, the great axe raised high. Around her, the thunder of chariot wheels, the whistle of arrows, the clash of bronze on bronze, the screams of the wounded and dying, the smell of blood and dust and sweat, the chaos of combat, and in the center of it all, Fu Hao, calm and commanding, directing the battle with gestures and shouts, her troops following her orders because they had seen her win before, because they believed in her, because she was Fu Hao, the woman who never lost. But warfare was only half of Fu Hao's life. The other half was spent in the temples and ritual spaces of Yin, performing the sacred duties that bound the Shang Dynasty to its ancestors and to heaven itself. To understand the importance of this role, we must understand Shang religion. The Shang worldview was animistic and deeply hierarchical. Everything had a spirit: mountains and rivers, wind and rain, crops and animals. Above these natural spirits were the ancestors, the dead members of the royal lineage who had passed into the spirit world but remained intimately concerned with the affairs of their living descendants. And above the ancestors was Shangdi, the Lord on high, the supreme deity who ruled over heaven and earth. The ancestors were not distant, abstract concepts. They were present, active participants in Shang life. They could bless or curse. They could bring victory in battle or defeat. They could grant good harvests or send drought and famine. They could heal illness or cause it. Every major decision required consulting the ancestors through divination, and every important event required appropriate sacrifices to ensure the ancestors' favor. The king was the primary intermediary with the spirit world. As the living head of the royal lineage, he had the duty and the right to communicate with the ancestors, to make offerings, to perform the rituals that maintained cosmic order. These were not empty ceremonies, but the most vital political acts in the Shang state. Control of ritual was control of the state itself. For Wu Ding to allow Fu Hao to perform these rituals was therefore extraordinary. The oracle bones record him repeatedly, instructing her to conduct sacrifices, to perform divinations, to offer specific animals or goods to specific ancestors on specific days. She was not merely assisting in these rituals, but performing them independently with her own authority. The items found in her tomb confirm this role: inscribed tortoise shells and ox bones, the tools of the diviner's trade; bronze ritual vessels for wine offerings, each one a masterpiece of art and craftsmanship, many inscribed with her name. These were not decorative objects, but functional implements of her office as high priestess. Imagine Fu Hao in the temple, dressed in ceremonial robes, perhaps wearing jade ornaments and bronze bells that chimed softly with each movement. Before her, a bronze vessel filled with ritual wine, its surface covered with coyote masks and stylized dragons. In her hands, a piece of turtle plastron or ox scapula, already carved with the question that needed answering: will the harvest be good? Will the expedition against the Qiang succeed? Will the king's toothache be cured? The divination process was complex and carefully choreographed. The question would be carved into the bone or shell. Then, a hot bronze rod or burning stick would be applied to the bone, heating it until it cracked. The pattern of the cracks, their length, direction, and configuration, would be interpreted by the diviner as the ancestor's answer. The question, the prognostication, and sometimes the verification of whether the prediction came true would all be carved into the bone, creating a permanent record. Fu Hao performed these divinations. She interpreted the cracks. She communed with the ancestors on behalf of the Shang state. She stood at the intersection of the human and spirit worlds, a mediator between the living and the dead. And the ancestors spoke to her. The oracle bones make this clear. She was not performing empty rituals or going through the motions. She was genuinely engaged in communication with the spirit realm, at least as she and her contemporaries understood it. Whether this was a matter of sincere belief, psychological projection, or something else entirely, we cannot say. But for Fu Hao and her world, the spirits were real, the ancestors were present, and her role as priestess was as important as her role as general. In fact, the two roles were intertwined. Before every major campaign, Fu Hao would perform divinations, asking the ancestors for their blessing, inquiring about the proper day to march, the right strategy to employ. After each victory, she would make offerings of thanks, sacrificing captured enemies and war spoils to honor the spirits who had granted her success. Warfare and religion were not separate spheres, but two aspects of the same cosmic struggle to maintain order and prosperity. In this way, Fu Hao embodied the complete Shang worldview. She was both warrior and priestess, destroyer and preserver, the hand that wielded the bronze axe and the voice that spoke the prayers. She operated in all the realms that mattered to the Shang, the temporal realm of political and military power, and the spiritual realm of ancestors and gods. Every story has an ending. Fu Hao's came around the year 1200 before the Common Era, give or take a few years. We do not know how she died. The oracle bones record Wu Ding's concern about her health at various points, asking the ancestors if she would recover from illness, if the proper sacrifices had been made. Given the context of these divinations, it's possible she died from complications of childbirth, a common danger in that age, or from disease. Perhaps, after years of military campaigns, her body simply gave out, worn down by the physical demands of warfare and travel. The sources offer no clear answer, only the king's worried inquiries, and then silence. What we know is that she died during Wu Ding's reign, and her death devastated the king. Wu Ding had Fu Hao's tomb constructed not in the royal cemetery at Yin, but across the river on her own land, a privilege granted to very few. This was both an honor and an indication of her unique status. Above the tomb, he built a memorial hall where he could make offerings and conduct ceremonies in her memory. And then he did something unprecedented. He married her to the ancestors, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Through elaborate ceremonies recorded on oracle bones, Wu Ding symbolically wed Fu Hao's spirit to 3 of the greatest Shang kings who had ruled before him. The oracle bone inscriptions mention specific royal ancestors. Though scholars debate the exact identities, the sources reference powerful kings from the dynasty's history, possibly including the dynasty's founder, Cheng Tang, among them. In this way, Wu Ding ensured that Fu Hao would be protected in the afterlife, cared for by the most powerful ancestral spirits in the royal lineage. He continued to consult her. The oracle bones from after Fu Hao's death record Wu Ding asking for her spiritual assistance in military campaigns, seeking her blessing, requesting her intervention with the other ancestors. When the Gong people attacked the Shang, threatening the dynasty's existence, Wu Ding made repeated sacrifices at Fu Hao's tomb, begging for her help from beyond the grave. She was deified, worshipped as an ancestral spirit in her own right, given the temple name Mu Xin, Mother Xin. Later generations of Shang rulers continued to honor her, making offerings at her tomb, seeking her favor. In death, as in life, Fu Hao held power. The tomb itself was remarkable. It was not large, a pit about 18 feet long and 13 feet wide, containing a wooden chamber about 16 feet long, 11.5 feet wide, and just over 4 feet high. But it was packed with treasures that testified to Fu Hao's status and achievements. 468 bronze objects, including 130 weapons. Great battle axes, like the one Wu Ding had given her, inscribed with her name. Dagger axes and spears, knives and arrowheads, the tools of a warrior's trade, buried with her so she could continue to fight in the afterlife. Bronze ritual vessels of exquisite craftsmanship, Jui wine vessels, Ding cauldrons, Gui food containers, each one a masterpiece, many inscribed with Fu Hao's name, proof of her role as priestess and her right to conduct sacred ceremonies. 700 jade objects, many of them already ancient in Fu Hao's time, suggesting she was a collector who valued heirlooms and trade goods from distant lands. Jade phoenixes and dragons, jade figurines and ornaments, jade combs and hairpins, more than 500 bone objects, ivory carvings, stone sculptures, mirrors of polished bronze, nearly 7,000 cowrie shells, which served as currency in the Shang world, evidence of Fu Hao's considerable wealth. And the human sacrifices. 16 people, likely slaves or prisoners of war, buried alive with Fu Hao to serve her in the afterlife. This was standard practice for Shang royal burials, grim but accepted in that ancient world. 6 dogs as well, perhaps hunting hounds or guard dogs, companions for her journey into the spirit realm. Fu Hao's own body had long since disintegrated. The organic matter returned to earth, but everything else remained, sealed in the tomb, hidden from grave robbers by its location outside the royal cemetery, forgotten as the centuries rolled past and the Shang Dynasty fell and the Zhou Dynasty rose and fell in turn, and the great philosophical traditions of China developed, and the empire grew and shrank and grew again, and the old ways were forgotten and remembered and forgotten again. For 3,200 years, give or take a century, Fu Hao's tomb lay undisturbed. The city of Yin was abandoned when the Zhou conquered the Shang around 1046 BCE. The site, known as Yinshu, the ruins of Yin, became a backwater, then farmland, then was gradually rediscovered in the late 19th century when local farmers began finding strange inscribed bones in their fields. These dragon bones, as they were called, were ground up and sold as medicine until scholars recognized the inscriptions as ancient Chinese writing. Systematic excavations began in the early 20th century, revealing the scope and sophistication of Shang civilization. But Fu Hao's tomb remained hidden until the spring of 1976. On May 16, 1976, a Sunday, Chinese archaeologist Zheng Zhenxiang and her team were conducting excavations at Yinshu, probing the earth with traditional Luoyang shovels. They had been working for weeks, following Zheng's conviction that a tomb lay hidden beneath a plot of land others believed was empty. Most of her colleagues disagreed. The royal cemetery at Yinshu had been thoroughly looted in ancient times, every major tomb robbed, its treasures scattered or melted down. Why would this location be any different? But Zheng persisted, and then, from 8 meters down, the shovel brought up something extraordinary, a sample of red lacquer, and glittering within it, a jade pendant. An anomaly in the soil, evidence of human activity in the distant past. Zheng Zhenxiang made the decision to expand the excavation. What they uncovered changed our understanding of ancient Chinese history. The tomb was intact, not just relatively undamaged, but completely untouched since the day it was sealed more than 3,000 years earlier. The wooden chamber had collapsed under the weight of earth, and the organic materials had decayed. But the bronze and jade, the stone and bone artifacts, remained exactly where they had been placed. And on the bronze vessels, carved and cast into the metal itself, was a name: Fu Hao. The archaeologists cross-referenced with the oracle bone inscriptions. They knew that name. It appeared again and again in divinations from Wu Ding's reign. Fu Hao, the general. Fu Hao, the priestess. Fu Hao, the queen. The oracle bones had told them that she existed, that she had fought battles and performed rituals and been honored by the king. But the tomb proved it beyond any doubt. This was not legend. This was not mythologized history embellished by later historians. This was primary evidence, contemporary records, physical objects touched and used by Fu Hao herself. The bronze axe inscribed with her name, the ritual vessels she had handled, the weapons that had equipped her armies, the jade ornaments she had worn. Everything was real, tangible, undeniable. The excavation took months. Every artifact was carefully documented, measured, photographed, removed, and preserved. The tomb became the most important archaeological find of the late 20th century in China, a window into the Shang Dynasty that was unparalleled in its completeness and detail. The artifacts were stunning in their beauty and craftsmanship. Bronze vessels decorated with coyote masks and dragons, each one cast using the sophisticated piece mold technique that the Shang had mastered. Jade carvings so delicate they seemed impossible given the tools available. The sheer wealth represented by the burial goods testified to Fu Hao's status. She had been buried with more treasures than many Shang kings. And the weapons. The weapons told their own story. This was not a ceremonial burial for a consort who had lived a sheltered life in the palace. This was the tomb of a warrior. The bronze axes alone weighed 9 kilograms each, massive implements designed to be symbols of command. The dagger axes and spears, the arrowheads by the hundreds. Everything spoke of warfare, of battles fought and won, of armies commanded and enemies defeated. The tomb was eventually opened to the public, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a testament to the woman who had been buried there. Museums displayed the artifacts, scholars studied the inscriptions, historians rewrote their accounts of the Shang Dynasty to give Fu Hao her proper place. She had been almost forgotten, relegated to a few mentions in oracle bone inscriptions that most people never saw. Now she was celebrated as the first female general in Chinese history, a woman who had shattered expectations and defied conventions 3,000 years before the modern age. To fully appreciate Fu Hao's achievements, we must understand that she was not entirely unique. The oracle bones record at least 100 women by name who participated in military activities during the Shang Dynasty. 600 women are mentioned as having military roles of various kinds. Another woman, Fu Jing, had weapons and military equipment buried in her tomb, suggesting she too had been a military commander. This is astonishing. In later Chinese history, under the influence of Confucian philosophy with its strict gender hierarchies and emphasis on female domesticity, women's roles became increasingly circumscribed. By the Zhou dynasty, just a few centuries after Fu Hao, women's status had already declined significantly. By the time of the Han dynasty, 1,000 years after the Shang, the idea of women serving as generals or performing state rituals was almost unthinkable. But the Shang dynasty existed before Confucius, before the philosophical traditions that would define Chinese culture for millennia. The Shang had different ideas about gender, different structures of power. Their society was what scholars call semi-matriarchal, with women having more rights and status than they would have in later periods. Shang aristocratic women could own property. They could control their own fiefs and command their own military forces. They could participate in rituals and even, in rare cases like Fu Hao, perform the most sacred ceremonies. They could be buried with the honors due to their achievements, not merely their gender. This does not mean the Shang dynasty was egalitarian or feminist in any modern sense. It was still a deeply hierarchical society with slavery, human sacrifice, and rigid class divisions. Most women, like most men, were commoners or slaves with little power or status. But for elite women, the possibilities were broader than they would be for the next 3,000 years of Chinese history. Fu Hao benefited from this cultural context, but she also transcended it. Even among the 100+ women mentioned in military contexts, Fu Hao stands out. No other woman is mentioned as often or as prominently in the oracle bone inscriptions. No other woman is recorded as commanding such large forces or winning such significant victories. No other woman is shown as both general and high priestess, combining military and religious authority. Fu Hao was exceptional, even in a society that allowed exceptional women to exist. And then that window closed. The Zhou dynasty conquered the Shang. Confucian philosophy developed with its emphasis on filial piety and patriarchal authority. Women were gradually removed from public life, their roles restricted to the domestic sphere. The memory of Shang women warriors faded, dismissed as legend, or ignored entirely by historians who could not imagine such things being true. For more than 3,000 years, Fu Hao's achievements were known only to scholars who studied oracle bone inscriptions, and even they could not be entirely sure she had been a real person rather than a mythological figure. The tomb changed that. The tomb proved beyond any doubt that Fu Hao had lived, had fought, had commanded armies, and performed sacred rituals, had been honored in death as she had been in life. She is a reminder that history is not a simple progression from primitive to advanced, from oppressive to enlightened. Different cultures at different times have had different structures and different possibilities. The Shang Dynasty, for all its brutality and strangeness, offered opportunities to elite women that would not exist again in China for thousands of years. What made Fu Hao such an effective general? How did she achieve victory after victory in an age of brutal, close-quarters warfare? Strategy and tactics are part of the answer. The oracle bones show her carefully planning campaigns, consulting about the best routes and timing, coordinating with other commanders. Her execution of the large-scale ambush against the Ba demonstrates sophisticated tactical thinking. She understood that surprise and maneuver could overcome superior numbers. Logistics also mattered. Ancient warfare was often decided not on the battlefield, but in the supply train. An army that ran out of food or lost its equipment was a defeated army, regardless of the courage of its troops. Fu Hao's ability to keep her forces supplied during campaigns that lasted weeks or months, marching through potentially hostile territory, shows organizational skills that matched her tactical acumen. Leadership was crucial. In an age when generals fought alongside their troops, personal courage was not optional. Fu Hao had to be willing to risk death, to face the same dangers as her soldiers. Her presence on the battlefield, visible and commanding, rallied her troops and intimidated her enemies. But there is something else, something harder to quantify. Charisma. The indefinable quality that makes some people natural leaders, that inspires loyalty and confidence, that makes others willing to follow them into danger. The oracle bones suggest that Wu Ding sent Fu Hao on campaigns not just because she was capable, but because she was the best option, the commander he trusted most. That trust was earned through repeated success, yes, but also through something intrinsic to Fu Hao herself. We can also consider the psychological impact of her gender. In a world where military command was almost exclusively male, Fu Hao's very presence on the battlefield was disruptive. Enemies who underestimated her paid a heavy price. Allies who fought beside her were energized by the novelty, and perhaps by a desire to prove themselves worthy of serving under such an unusual commander. Fu Hao's gender, which might have been a liability, became an asset because she was exceptional enough to transcend expectations. And she had the support of Wu Ding. The king's absolute confidence in his wife gave Fu Hao the authority she needed to command effectively. No general can succeed without the trust of their sovereign, and Wu Ding's trust in Fu Hao was absolute. He gave her the largest armies, the most difficult assignments, the most important campaigns, and she delivered, again and again. The oracle bones record that after her death, when the gong threatened the Shang Dynasty's existence, Wu Ding made repeated sacrifices at Fu Hao's tomb, seeking her spiritual help. In his darkest hour, facing enemies that might destroy everything he had built, the king turned to his dead wife for aid. That is the measure of his respect for her abilities. Fu Hao won battles, many battles, dozens of campaigns over what appears to have been a career spanning at least a decade, possibly two. The phrase, "woman who won 100 battles," is not literal. The oracle bones do not record exactly how many military actions she commanded. But the number of campaigns mentioned, the variety of enemies defeated, the consistent pattern of victory, all suggest a military career of extraordinary success. She defeated the Tu Fang, who had resisted the Shang for generations. She crushed the Qiang with an army of 13,000. She led ambushes and direct assaults, coordinated multi-army operations, and independent campaigns. She fought in every direction, north against the nomadic tribes, south against the Ba, east against the Yi, west against various Fang peoples. Wherever the Shang faced a threat, Fu Hao was sent. And wherever Fu Hao was sent, the Shang prevailed. But Fu Hao's importance extends beyond her military achievements. In the Shang worldview, where the spiritual and temporal realms were inseparable, her role as high priestess was just as significant as her role as general. The Shang believed that the ancestors actively intervened in the world of the living. A good harvest or a military victory was not merely the result of human effort, but also of ancestral favor. Conversely, disaster and defeat came from displeasing the spirits. Maintaining proper relations with the ancestors was therefore the most important task of the state. Fu Hao's ability to perform the highest rituals meant that she could directly influence the spiritual forces that shaped Shang fortunes. When she made offerings to the ancestors before a campaign, she was not going through empty motions, but actively soliciting divine aid. When she interpreted oracle bone cracks, she was communicating the will of the spirits to guide human action. This gave her a unique form of authority. Military power could be challenged by other warriors. Political power could be undermined by rivals. But spiritual authority, the ability to commune with the ancestors and Shangdi, was granted by the divine realm itself. No human could take that away. The fact that Wu Ding entrusted Fu Hao with these rituals shows that he believed she had a genuine connection to the spiritual world. In the Shang mindset, you could not fake such a connection. If the ancestors did not favor someone, the divinations would fail, the sacrifices would be ineffective, disasters would follow. That Fu Hao continued to perform rituals throughout her life, that the oracle bones record no instances of her rituals going wrong or her divinations being inaccurate, suggests that she was successful in this role, just as she was successful on the battlefield. After her death, Fu Hao herself became an ancestor, a spirit to be consulted and honored. Wu Ding's repeated requests for her spiritual assistance were not metaphorical. He genuinely believed that Fu Hao's spirit could intervene from the afterlife, could speak to the other ancestors on the Shang's behalf, could influence battles and harvests and the fate of the dynasty. In this way, Fu Hao transcended mortality. Her physical body had died, but her spiritual presence remained active in Shang affairs. For the remainder of Wu Ding's reign, and for generations afterward, Fu Hao was invoked in rituals, offered sacrifices, consulted through divination. She continued to serve the Shang Dynasty even after death. This is perhaps her greatest legacy, not just what she achieved in life, but how she was remembered after death. Fu Hao became part of the pantheon of honored ancestors, her name preserved in bronze and oracle bone, her achievements celebrated in ritual, her spirit called upon in times of crisis. At the heart of Fu Hao's story is her relationship with Wu Ding. This was not a fairy tale romance, but a partnership between two powerful individuals who understood each other and worked together toward common goals. Wu Ding was one of the most successful Shang kings, ruling for perhaps 59 years, according to later historical records, though modern scholars debate the exact length. His reign saw the Shang Dynasty reach its apex, expanding its territory, consolidating its power, developing its bronze technology and writing system. Wu Ding was a reformer who promoted talented individuals regardless of their social background, like Fu Hao, the slave who became a trusted advisor. He was also someone who recognized ability in his wives. Out of 60 or more consorts, he elevated Fu Hao to a position of prominence not because of her family connections or political value, but because of her personal capabilities. He gave her military command. He allowed her to perform state rituals. He granted her land and independent resources. He trusted her judgment and followed her advice. This was not weakness or infatuation overcoming practical judgment. Wu Ding was a successful king precisely because he was good at identifying talent and putting it to work. Fu Hao was talented, perhaps brilliantly so, and Wu Ding had the wisdom to recognize that and the courage to act on it despite social conventions that might have discouraged such unusual appointments. The oracle bones show them as partners. Wu Ding consulted the ancestors about Fu Hao's campaigns, but did not micromanage her. He gave her the resources and authority she needed, and then trusted her to use them effectively. She, in turn, served him loyally, fighting his wars, performing his rituals, governing her fief, sending tribute back to the capital. When she was pregnant, Wu Ding showed genuine concern, repeatedly asking the ancestors if she would give birth safely, if the child would be healthy. When she was ill, he made offerings for her recovery. These are not the actions of a distant monarch dealing with a functionary, but of a husband worried about his wife. And after she died, Wu Ding mourned. He built her tomb. He constructed a memorial hall. He married her spirit to the greatest ancestors. He sought her aid from beyond the grave. For the rest of his life, decades perhaps, Wu Ding honored Fu Hao's memory. This was a relationship that transcended the typical dynamics of royal marriages in ancient societies, which were usually political arrangements with little personal connection. Wu Ding and Fu Hao seem to have genuinely cared for each other, to have respected each other's abilities, to have worked together as true partners. In a time when most royal wives were little more than symbols, Fu Hao was a force in her own right. And Wu Ding not only allowed that, but celebrated it, supported it, amplified it. His legacy is inextricably linked with hers. He was a great king, in part because he had the wisdom to recognize greatness in his wife and the strength to let her exercise it. Fu Hao died during Wu Ding's reign, decades before the fall of the Shang Dynasty. She did not live to see the empire she had fought to defend come crashing down. Perhaps that was a mercy. Wu Ding himself died around 1192 before the Common Era, after a long and successful reign. He was succeeded by his sons and grandsons, who continued to rule from Yin for several generations. But the Shang Dynasty's power gradually eroded. Later kings were less capable or less fortunate. The military campaigns that had expanded Shang territory under Wu Ding became defensive struggles. The vassal states and allied tribes that had once sent tribute began to slip away from Shang control. And in the West, a new power was rising. The Zhou people, once vassals of the Shang, began to consolidate their own territory and build their own armies. They developed a new ideology, the Mandate of Heaven, which held that the right to rule was granted by heaven itself and could be transferred from one dynasty to another if the current rulers became corrupt or incompetent. In approximately 1046 BCE, the Zhou King Wu attacked the Shang capital. The last Shang king, Di Xin, led his armies out to meet the invaders. They fought a great battle, and the Shang lost. Di Xin retreated to his palace, dressed himself in his finest robes and jewelry, and set himself on fire, burning to death rather than surrender. The Shang Dynasty was over. The Zhou conquered the Shang territories, established their own capital, and began rewriting history. They portrayed the Shang kings, particularly Di Xin, as corrupt tyrants whose overthrow was justified by heaven. They absorbed some Shang practices and discarded others, They continued the tradition of bronze casting, but changed the styles. They used oracle bones, but less frequently. They gradually developed new philosophical traditions that would become dominant in Chinese culture. The city of Yin was abandoned. The great palaces crumbled. The bronze foundries went cold. The ritual spaces were neglected. The elaborate system of ancestor worship that had defined Shang religion was gradually replaced by Zhou practices and, later, by the philosophical schools of Confucianism and Taoism. And Fu Hao was forgotten. Not entirely. The oracle bones remained, buried in the ruins of Yin, preserving her name and her deeds in the archaic script that fewer and fewer people could read as the centuries passed. Occasional scholars might stumble across references to her in ancient texts or inscriptions. But to most people, for most of history, Fu Hao was unknown. The rise of Confucian philosophy, beginning about 700 years after Fu Hao's death, fundamentally changed Chinese society's views on women. Confucius taught the importance of hierarchical relationships and clearly defined roles. Women's place, in the Confucian vision, was in the home, supporting their husbands and raising their children. Women who exercised public power or engaged in warfare were seen as violations of natural order. In this context, Fu Hao's achievements became literally unthinkable. The idea of a woman commanding armies, performing state rituals, governing a fief, seemed absurd, impossible, contrary to nature itself. If later historians encountered references to Fu Hao, they might dismiss them as errors or exaggerations, myths rather than history. The oracle bones were rediscovered in the late 19th century, but it took decades for scholars to decipher them fully and understand their significance. Even then, the references to Fu Hao were scattered across hundreds of different inscriptions, brief mentions that had to be painstakingly pieced together to construct a coherent narrative. Some historians doubted that Fu Hao had been a real person. Perhaps she was a goddess or a mythological figure whose name had been incorporated into historical records. Perhaps the oracle bone inscriptions were metaphorical rather than literal. Perhaps women really couldn't have held military command in ancient China, regardless of what the sources said. And then came 1976 and the opening of the tomb. All doubts vanished. Fu Hao had lived. She had fought. She had won. And she had been honored in death as she deserved. In the decades since the tomb's discovery, Fu Hao has been reclaimed by history. She has become a symbol of female achievement, proof that women's roles have varied dramatically across time and culture, evidence that the limitations placed on women in later Chinese history were cultural constructs rather than biological inevitabilities. Museums in China prominently feature artifacts from Fu Hao's tomb. Exhibitions travel the world, introducing international audiences to this remarkable figure from Bronze Age China. Scholars continue to study the oracle bone inscriptions, refining our understanding of her life and career. Historical novels and television dramas retell her story, sometimes with dramatic embellishments, but always rooted in the documented facts. She has become an icon, and like all icons, she risks being simplified or distorted by modern agendas. Some portray her as a proto-feminist, a warrior against patriarchy, which is anachronistic. Fu Hao lived in a world with very different concepts of gender and power. She was not fighting to liberate all women, but serving her king and defending her dynasty. Others emphasize her uniqueness, making her an exception that proves the rule of women's subordination, which also misses the point. Fu Hao was exceptional, yes, but she existed in a cultural context that made her achievements possible. The Shang Dynasty had structures that allowed elite women to exercise power in ways that later Chinese dynasties did not. The truth, as always, is more complex and more interesting than any simple narrative. Fu Hao was a product of her time and culture, benefiting from opportunities that most women in most eras did not have. She was also an individual of remarkable ability who exceeded even those broad possibilities through her own talents and efforts. She was both typical of Shang elite women and extraordinary even by those standards. What makes Fu Hao's story compelling is not that it fits some modern template of female empowerment, but that it challenges our assumptions about the past. We often imagine ancient societies as uniformly oppressive to women, as cultures where women had no power or agency. The Shang Dynasty and Fu Hao's life within it demonstrate that history is more varied than that simple model suggests. Different cultures at different times have had different structures. Some have been more egalitarian than others. Some have allowed women more freedom and authority than others. The arc of history does not bend inevitably toward greater gender equality. Progress is not automatic or guaranteed. Gains can be lost. Opportunities can close. The Shang Dynasty gave elite women like Fu Hao chances to command armies and perform rituals. The Zhou Dynasty restricted women's roles. Later dynasties restricted them further. It took 3,000 years for Chinese women to regain some of the authority that Shang women had exercised. This is Fu Hao's most important lesson for us. History is not a simple story of progress. It is a complex tapestry of advances and retreats, of possibilities opened and closed, of achievements won and lost and won again. 3,200 years after her death, Fu Hao's name echoes through the halls of history. Her tomb sits at Yinshu, carefully preserved, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, visited by thousands every year. Her bronze vessels and jade ornaments reside in museums, studied by scholars, admired by visitors. Her battle axes with her name inscribed in ancient script testify to victories won and enemies defeated. The oracle bones still speak her name: Fu Hao, Lady Hao, General Hao, High Priestess, Queen, Warrior, Mother, Goddess. All these roles, all these identities, woven together in one remarkable life. We know more about Fu Hao than we know about almost any other individual from the Bronze Age. The combination of oracle bone inscriptions and the intact tomb gives us a level of detail that is extraordinary for this period in history. We know what weapons she used. We know what campaigns she fought. We know how she was honored in death. We can trace the outline of her life with unusual clarity for someone who lived over 3,000 years ago. Yet, in another sense, Fu Hao remains mysterious. We do not know what she looked like. We do not know her thoughts or her dreams. We do not know if she was happy, if she loved her husband, if she was afraid before battles, if she regretted leaving her son to lead armies into distant lands. The oracle bones record her deeds, but not her inner life. She remains, in some ways, an enigma. A woman who walked through a world so different from ours that we can barely comprehend it, who made choices and faced challenges that we can only imagine. She speaks to us across an immense gulf of time and culture, and we strain to hear her voice, to understand her story, to make sense of a life so remarkable and so strange. But this much we know. Fu Hao lived. She fought. She won. She commanded armies and communed with spirits. She defended her dynasty and performed sacred rituals. She owned land and governed people. She was honored in life and worshipped in death. She was one of the most powerful people in the ancient world, man or woman. And when she died, her husband, the king, built her a tomb filled with treasures, married her spirit to the greatest ancestors, and continued to seek her aid from beyond the grave for the rest of his life. That is love. That is respect. That is recognition of greatness.